say? Okay, look, this works. Rogowski, would you mind sitting down? You're an important person, but for the moment you must sit, and later perhaps you can stand when you leave. We'll interpret it as innovation as opposed to an exit. So, my enormous pleasure to be in front of such an extraordinarily good-looking and fluffy audience for a law school or for a legal inaugural. My reason for being here, which is probably not obvious, is partly sartorial. It's partly that for 20 years, for nigh on 201, for a long time, I have known... It's a noisy device. I have known Paul Raffield. He came into my office at Birkbeck College, 1993. And he suggested, with great seriousness, suit and tie, it'd be a good idea if he came and did a PhD. He was a barrister, he said, who had gone into the acting profession. And the acting profession is one of chronic unemployment, as you all know, and he felt a desire for a degree of security that he somehow felt that law and law lecturing could provide. And to give some veneer of seriousness of intent, he suggested that he would do a PhD on the interstices of the administrative procedures necessary to procure a writ of mandamus in the courts of Western Wales. And I stared at him blankly. I was silent, which Alan Norrie would take as a sign of great cogitative process, but in fact, I was simply mentally gawping at him, and I said, well, Paul, that doesn't sound like a very good idea to me. If you are an actor, then wouldn't it be a good idea to do something that conjoined acting and law? And so he commenced, and I'm pleased to see in his curriculum vitae, which he kindly shared with me, all 223 pages of it, that he starts out actually by saying that he is a professional actor. He started as a professional actor, which begs the question of what he is now. He is presumably a genre actor, a character actor, a lesser actor, or an unprofessional actor, but nonetheless an actor always, and I hope an actor for many years to come. The other dimension to this story, of course, is that I was his supervisor. As many of you will know, there are only 3 possible relationships between a supervisor and a dissertator or student, research student. Those 3 types I've classified, and then discovered that Steiner had also classified, and there's a fantastic book, should you be interested, by Françoise Waquet on Les Enfants de Socrate, which is a study of supervisor-dissertator relationships from 1660 to the 21st century. Unfortunately, for reasons beyond my comprehension, but with the result of tremendous obscurity, she wrote it in French. I think it was a poor decision, but nonetheless makes it a little bit hard to access. But she too takes up this tripartite distinction. So the options basically are murder, tribute, or supersession. Well, with respect to murder, one would be unlikely to have any direct experience as the supervisor. Attempted murder maybe, but I think it's safe to say that as I am standing here, and unless I fall off the stage, I am alive. Our relationship was not murderous. I'm thankful for that. Tribute is interesting. Tribute is joining the tribe. It's becoming one of us, and I think that Paul has undoubtedly done that, and today's elevation will be a further instance of that. But really, Paul has superseded. It is most important that the student exceeds the supervisor, that they write more, they publish in better places, they launch greater journals, and they do bigger things. And I'm happy to say that Paul has done all of that. He has cast me into the shadow that I so richly deserve. And I'm thankful for that. He has taken the weight off my shoulders, the burden from my back, and I'm free to simply bask in the flow of his rhetoric and the longevity of his publications. Having said that, I guess there's only one final word, which is to make a small mention of the nomination of our new professor. In nominis ossibus inherent, the name inheres in the bones. And this is none other than Paul Raffield, which I assumed was a field of Rafe, although I had no idea what Rafe was. It sounded a little bit dangerous, but nonetheless, he comes from the north, God knows, Rafe, probably mispronunciation of rape. Seed, that is, rape seed. But no, actually, curiously, Paulus means little in Latin, that's the root, so he's not so tall, he's great in stature, but not in size, so Paulus, fine. But Raffield, well, here's the story. There is Michelangelo, there's Leonardo da Vinci, and there's Raphael. And here we have, with all his art and artifice, none other than Paulus Raphael. So take the stage.
Thank you, Peter. I'll try to follow that as best I can. Well, as Peter said, and as many of you know, anyway, before Peter did that very generous introduction, before I was appointed to Warwick in 2004, I had made my living as an actor for 25 years. I made a very good living as an actor, actually, despite what you say. It all went rather well. But it's taken till tonight, I suppose, for me to get my first one-man show. I'd always worked before with other people, so I'm up here on my own tonight, which I always thought in the theatre would be rather a daunting thing. Anyway, I said to some of you today when people were saying, "You're looking forward to tonight?" And I said, well, yes, I am. I'm a little bit nervous, but there's that. The most pragmatic advice you can give an actor is to say to them, remember your lines and don't bump into the furniture. And that I will try to do tonight, but I can't promise. But I hope anyway that I'll manage to keep you interested for the pretty short time that I'm going to be talking to you. Now, the theme of tonight's lecture is really about the power of the image. Before I get going on it, therefore, I thought I'd address that theme with reference to the poster for this inaugural lecture. And I'm coming at it from the point of view as an actor. Warwick Print, I think, have done a wonderful job on it. But I have to say, I don't get top billing. Top billing goes to the law school. Now, if you're an actor, billing is very, very important. Ideally, you want to be above the title. That's the place to be. There's the title, right? Now, there's me. Okay? Now, some years ago, I did a play in the West End, one of several plays I did in the West End. This was a very successful play. Peter actually came to see it. It was called Neville's Island by Tim Firth. And there were 4 of us in the cast, and we all had our names above the title. The 4 of us. Now, mine was the last on the list, okay? It went Tony Slattery, Jonathan Coy, Michael Siberry, and Paul Raffield. Now, I wasn't top of the bill, but for an actor, you don't want to be in the middle. It's much better to be a with or an and. So I was and Paul Raffield, which was good enough for me. A friend of mine came to see it, and he said to me afterwards, they should have warned the public in advance. It should have said, but Paul Raffield. There we go. I do just want to say a couple of words of thanks before I get going on the lecture proper. I'm sure she won't mind waiting for me a bit. I want to thank Peter, obviously. We did have a marvellous relationship as supervisor and supervisee. It was by no means murderous. It would have been hard to murder you anyway, because you went and lived in America after only 2 years, while I was still in London, so it would have been difficult. But Peter and I maintain a wonderful relationship as scholars, colleagues, and as friends. And I value that friendship enormously. When I knew I was doing the inaugural, I emailed Peter straight away and I said, please would you come over from New York and chair my inaugural? And he emailed me back straight away and said yes. He'd love to, and here he is. He's been an inspiration to me throughout my career as an academic and continues to be so, and influences an awful lot still of what I do. Because that's another way of saying, if you don't like what you hear tonight, don't blame me, blame him. But that isn't really fair. In fact, it's not fair at all. But as I said to some of you, if you don't like what you hear, please don't throw things tonight, because I've had the soup cleaned, and I'd much rather you heckle. I can deal with heckling. But please don't throw, particularly not soft fruit. Other thanks. The law school for encouraging me in my work, both in research and in teaching, not only in encouraging me, but in putting up with me. Because I know I can be noisy at times and a bit of a nuisance, but I do appreciate all of you. My academic colleagues, obviously, who continue to support me and inspire me, but not only them, the administrative and support staff, without whose help I couldn't do half the things that I do. So thank you all. The university, obviously, for promoting me, because it's always nice to get a bit of recognition, isn't it? But what it does for me is it shows that they do value the interdisciplinary research and teaching that I do, that they put a value on law and literature, law and history, law and the humanities. So I value that enormously. And finally, my thanks go to my wonderful students, some of whom are there at the back. You're marvellous. You make it really worthwhile. We have the greatest fun in our classes. We share ideas, and you give me inspiration. So thank you, all of you. You might be wondering what this crown is doing down here. Okay. Well, don't worry, power hasn't gone to my head. What it is, a colleague said to me, are you going to do any acting in your inaugural lecture? By which I think they meant, was I going to do a bit from a play, you know? Well, the problem is, as I said, this is my first one-man show. So when I've acted before, there's always been other people around. And you can see it's not a very big stage, as you can see. It's a bit hard to get the cast of Henry V on the front here. And then I thought, oh, well, I'm doing this lecture all about royal portraiture and the connections between the portraits of Elizabeth I and the portrait of Richard II, the coronation portrait of Richard II. And then I remembered, a long, long time ago, when I was 26 years old, I played Richard II in Shakespeare's The Tragedy of King Richard II. You have to use your imagination here a bit. I had black hair, blue eyes, and a 28-inch waist. I've still got the blue eyes, we're working on the waist, and I've given up with the hair. But I thought, okay, I'll do it. I'm on the stage, I may as well have a go. At the end of this little piece I'm going to do, I can do a soliloquy. I can't get the whole cast of Richard II up here on stage, but I will do a soliloquy. Whether I remember it or not is another matter entirely, but I'll have a go. And it links up with all the stuff I'm talking about tonight, which is all about the image, the power of the image. I'll just remove your newspaper piece we have tonight. And so, here we go, the main event. So, here we are. I am Richard II. Know ye not that? Elizabeth I was supposed to have asked this question in August 1601 of William Lambard, antiquary, lawyer, and newly appointed keeper of the records. Earlier that year, the Essex Rebellion had been staged, ending in ignominious failure for the participants and in execution for the eponymous Earl. For Shakespeare scholars, the most memorable moment in this misguided and botched attempt at decisive political action against an absolutist regime was the staging of Shakespeare's Richard II at the Globe Theatre on the afternoon of the 7th of February 1601, the eve of the rebellion. The supporters of Essex had commissioned this one-off performance by the Lord Chamberlain's men in an attempt to rally support from the citizens of London for the next day's insurrection. The play portrays an absolutist and airless monarch, and its central scene depicts the deposition of a king and the usurpation of the throne. Now, my interest lies not in establishing or refuting whether Elizabeth intended comparison to be made with Shakespeare's Richard II or the actual Richard II. I'm concerned rather with exploring the iconography and semiotics of kingship in figurative art, through which we may identify a visual rhetoric that, in the words of Peter Goodrich, marks the entry of the individual into the symbolic, the capture of the subject of law. Now, an analysis such as this locates its subject in the realm of the aesthetic image, or rather, in Nietzschean terms, in the ordered and artificial dream world of Apollo. As Louis Marin noted in his study of Louis XIV, the king is only truly king, that is monarch, in images. They are his real presence. Marin refers not only to the persuasive power of royal iconography, but also to a mystical process of transubstantiation, whereby the person of the king is recreated as the monarch. The symbolic connection with the Eucharist, at a theoretical level, what may be termed the absent presence of the deity, is obvious, and is one that was artfully nurtured by the kings of medieval and early modern Europe. In terms of medieval political theology, the phenomenon of kingship may be explained by reference to the character angelicus of the king. In other words, as Ernst Kantorowicz famously opined, the body politic of the king represents, like the angels, the immutable within time. Now, although the Tudor monarchs cultivated and exploited the idea of the king as imago Dei, the image of God, the first English monarch to establish what might be termed the theatre of divine kingship was Richard II. It was during the reign of Richard II that a vocabulary not only of words, but also of gesture was developed, intended to represent and enhance the mystical presence of the king. For example, Sir John Bushy, Speaker of the House of Commons in 1397, recalled that whenever he addressed the king, who was seated on his throne, he would extend his arms and supplicate with his hands, as if praying to him, entreating his high, excellent, and most praiseworthy majesty that he might deign to concede these or those things. Well, there's much in common with the visual rhetoric associated with Elizabethan rule, and it may have been this theatrical aspect of Ricardian kingship, as well as Richard's lack of an heir, his absolutism, and his eventual deposition, that the Queen had in mind when she posed her enigmatic question to Lambard. I am Richard II. Know ye not that? Returning briefly to the Lambard manuscript, the narrative continues. Then, returning to Richard II, she, Elizabeth, demanded whether I had seen any true picture or lively representation of his countenance and person. The fascination of Elizabeth with Richard II, or to be more precise, with the representation of Richard II, is demonstrable. It's at least partly based upon that particular king's manipulation of spiritual iconography for temporal purposes, strengthening and extending the ambit of the royal prerogative. The most striking images of Richard II that were painted during his lifetime are undoubtedly the Coronation portrait in Westminster Abbey, painted around 1395, and the Wilton diptych, painted between 1395 and 1399, and I'll come on to that in a bit. The Coronation portrait of Richard is the earliest known contemporaneous portrait of an English monarch, and I shall argue it serves as a template and precedent for the Coronation portrait of Elizabeth I. Now, in this portrait of Richard, the newly crowned king stares directly at the viewer. The sceptre, symbol of temporal authority, there it is, in his left hand, and the orb, symbol of Christ's dominion over the world, in his right, also symbol of his role as God's anointed deputy. The facial resemblance of the king to popular images of Christ is such that Nigel Saul describes it as like an iconic close-up of the face of Christ. The pose was to recur in numerous Renaissance depictions of biblical scenes, as for example in Piero della Francesca's Resurrection, painted around 1463, in which the risen Christ stares unflinchingly over his sovereign territory, the flag of the resurrection in his hand. Well, throughout her 45-year reign, Elizabeth was herself the subject of numerous portraits, many of which sought to mythologize her as a goddess, endowing her with supernatural powers. For example, Elizabeth I and the Three Goddesses, painted in 1569, attributed to Hans Ewert, in which the aura of splendour surrounding the Queen alarms and discomforts Juno, there's Juno, with the peacock on her shoulder, Pallas Minerva, and Venus, with Cupid next to her. Venus can only gaze in wonderment at her beauty. And also the Ditchley portrait here, painted to commemorate the visit by Elizabeth to Sir Henry Lee's house in Ditchley, Oxfordshire, in which the Queen, supremely majestic here, she appears to float over a map of England, thunderous skies behind her, and bright sunlight in front, and her feet rest on the county of Oxfordshire in appreciation of the hospitality she received at Ditchley. Well, there was another iconic figure with whom the Queen was associated, a virginal iconic figure, and which links the portraiture of Elizabeth with the religious iconography surrounding Richard II. I refer to the Blessed Virgin Mary. Indeed, it's been argued that the cult of Elizabeth was a response to strenuous attempts made during the English Reformation to disband the cult of the Virgin Mary. In some 16th century eyes, Elizabeth was a Protestant substitute for a Roman Catholic icon of motherhood and selfless devotion. The coronation portrait of Elizabeth I depicts the Queen crowned and wearing the cloth of gold robes which she wore at her coronation on the 15th of January 1559. The same robes had been worn by her predecessor Mary at her coronation. The portrait was painted between 1600 and 1610. It's been argued that it's a copy of a lost original, completed at some point in 1559, but no evidence exists of an earlier version. There is, however, one outstanding precedent: the coronation portrait of Richard II. The portrait of Elizabeth is a portrait not only of a monarch, but a depiction also of youthful femininity and beauty, even of vulnerability. It's strikingly similar in theme, composition, and appearance to the coronation portrait of Richard II. The crown, orb, and sceptre are regal artifacts common to both paintings. The shapes of the faces in the two portraits are similar. So too is the colouring of the hair. Both gaze directly at the viewer, expressing the inexperience of youth. At his coronation in 1377, Richard was only 10. At hers in 1559, Elizabeth was 25. Both convey also the mystical aura of kinship, the body natural subsumed into the body politic. Arguably, the most significant historical fact regarding the portraits is that they were painted retrospectively. Neither was contemporaneous with the actual event depicted in the painting. The portrait of Elizabeth was painted more than 40 years after her coronation, and that of Richard between 18 and 22 years after his. Richard himself commissioned this portrait, and it appears that the form and subject matter of the painting were determined by political events of the mid